Let me start with a lesson that we all learned in childhood, which is that you can have too much of a good thing. In fact, figuring out what's good is usually the easy part. Figuring out when you've had enough is usually the hard part. I know I should have dinner tonight. I'm not sure whether I should have a third helping. The same thing comes up in social policies. I know my town should have a fire department. I don't know whether it should have a bigger fire department. So the interesting economic problem is often, when do you stop? How do you know when you've had enough? Just as you can have too much of a good thing, you can have too little of a bad thing. Let's take pollution, for example. We all agree pollution is a bad thing, but I think we also agree that nobody would want to live in a world with zero pollution, because a world with zero pollution would be a world with no buildings, no travel. None of us would have been able to get to Coventry. We certainly wouldn't be having this meeting today. Pollution is a necessary byproduct of other things that we like having, and so we're willing to put up with a certain amount of it. That means that there is a right amount of pollution, not zero. And that raises the interesting question, do we currently have too much pollution or too little? Once you've agreed that the right amount's not zero, it's not immediately obvious whether we would be happier in a world with more or a world with less. Well, I think I know the answer to that. I think the world has too much pollution. I think we'd be happier with less. And here's why I think that. Because by and large, the people who decide to create pollution are not the people who have to live with the consequences of that pollution. And when people don't have to live with the consequences of their actions, they tend to do too much of the bad stuff and too little of the good stuff. That's why we have too much pollution. It's why we got too few people out in the park picking up trash. It's the benefits of going out there and picking up trash. They fall on other people, not so much on you, and so you do too little of it. That's easy to understand, easy to believe. I think all economics students understand it, and I think most people intuitively understand it. But let's take that simple principle. What I want to do is take that simple principle that we all agree on and apply it in a couple of non-traditional contexts and see if it leads us someplace surprising. So let's start right off with this. Does the world have too much or too little casual sex? Well, let's take an example. Let's think this through. Suppose, for starters, that you happen to be a very reckless, promiscuous person with a lot of partners in the past, and you haven't been very careful. And when I say suppose that you are this person, I want to make it clear I'm not looking at any specific person in the room. But suppose that you are such a person, and you go out tonight looking for a new partner. Well, you're making the world a more dangerous place. You're making the world a more dangerous place for other people, and you're doing that in a way where the costs largely fall on other people rather than on you. You're polluting the partner pool that everybody else is fishing in. And just as we have too much of every other kind of pollution, for exactly the same reason, we have too much of that kind of pollution too. Those people have too many partners because when they choose to take another partner, they don't fully account for all the costs they're imposing on the rest of the world. Okay, nobody has any trouble believing that. Now let's look at the flip side of it. Suppose instead that you are a particularly cautious person, a person who is probabilistically much less likely than the average person to be infected with anything terrible. You go out tonight and you take a new partner, you've made the world a safer place. That person who's going home with you is having safer sex than they realize. You have improved the quality of the partner pool. You've improved the quality of the average match in terms of the probability that something terrible is being spread. And by the same principle that tells me that there are not enough people out there picking up trash in the park, that tells me that you're not having enough partners. Because a lot of those benefits of your behavior are falling on other people, and you're not accounting for that when you're deciding how many partners to have. That suggests that the world would be a better place if we could get those very cautious people to go out and have more partners. Now, not too many more partners, because we don't want to turn them into those promiscuous, dangerous people. Okay? There's a right amount. As with everything else, there's a right amount. What this suggests is that there's such a thing as too much, there's such a thing as too little, and currently we got too little. In fact, if you are that cautious, unpromiscuous, careful person, and you go out and take another partner tonight, you're making the world safer in two ways. I told you the more obvious way. You're improving the odds of the person who goes home with you. But there's a second way in which you're making the world safer, which is empirically a lot more important, although also substantially more macabre, and it's this. If you go out tonight and take a new partner, you might hook up with somebody infected. You might catch a horrible disease. And if you do, odds are you're going to go home and die. And that's wonderful. Because when you die, the virus dies with you. And if somebody's going to get infected tonight, I want it to be you and not my friend Promiscuous Pete, who's going to spread it to 20 other people before he dies. I want it to be spread to the people who habitually have very few partners. Okay? Now, that's a second reason, and again, empirically, the more important reason why the world would be a better place if people like that went out and had more partners. Unfortunately, you can't use this as a pickup line. You can't, it's not going to work. Okay? If you go into a bar and say, you should go home with me tonight because think how wonderful it would be if I infected you and you went home and died and took the virus with you, okay? You're not going to get very far with that, but that's the whole point, right? The whole point is that there's a disconnect between what's good for the individual and what's good for the larger society. Okay? That's the whole point. That's the whole reason we're getting the wrong amount of too much sex from one kind of people, too little from another kind of people. Economic theory, pure economic theory tells me that the world would be a better place, that economic welfare would rise, what we call in the textbooks social gain or social welfare would rise if the very promiscuous people reined themselves in and if the very cautious people loosened up a little bit. But what does it mean to say economic welfare would rise? There are in this context two different ways that could happen. One way it could happen is you could actually slow down the spread of disease. That would be a wonderful thing. A different way it could happen is that you might actually get some increase in the amount of disease, but you would get such a disproportionately large increase in the amount of sexual activity that welfare would go up because people are having so much fun that it compensates for the additional disease you're spreading. Those are two things that could possibly happen. The pure theory tells us that when people don't take account of all the benefits that they're imposing on other people, then if you could get them to do a little more of this stuff, welfare would go up. It doesn't tell you how welfare goes up. It might go up by reducing disease. It might go up by increasing disease, but increasing the amount of fun people's having by so much that it's worth it. That becomes an empirical question, or at least a question that needs some more theory. Here's an axis showing quantity of partners. There's the actual quantity that our hypothetical, very cautious person is currently having. The welfare maximizing quantity, as I said, is going to be bigger. But it becomes a question, where's the disease minimizing quantity? That could be on either side of what we've currently got. The theory we've got so far doesn't tell us that. For that, you need more theory. You need more theory, you need more economic theory, and you need that theory to be well informed by a familiarity with the theory of epidemiology and the way viruses spread. Well, fortunately, there's a guy at Harvard named Michael Kramer who knows a lot about economics and knows a lot about epidemiology and knows a lot about modeling. And he's thought about this question very hard. And his best estimate is that the disease minimizing quantity is in fact larger than the current quantity. In other words, if those cautious people had more sex, not only would welfare increase, but we know how it would increase, namely disease would there would be less disease. By how much? Okay, well, Kramer's estimate is that if you took everybody in Great Britain who currently has averages fewer than 2.25 partners per year, and brought them all up to 2.25 partners per year, but not past that, that you would substantially slow down the spread of HIV. That's surprising. You can ask what it leads to in terms of policy. You know, when we think about other issues like this, when we think about pollution, we say pollution is harmful, so we ought to tax it. Sex by the very promiscuous and reckless is harmful, so we ought to tax it. Picking up trash in the park is helpful, so we ought to subsidize it. Sex by the very cautious and unpromiscuous is helpful, so maybe we should subsidize that. The problem is, you know, so we give you $1 if you can prove you had a new partner last night. The problem is that we don't know who's who. We don't know who the cautious people are and who the promiscuous people are. In fact, if we all knew that, the problem would go away, because if our past histories were visible to everyone, then you would get rewarded for your cautious past behavior by being more desirable in the mating market, right? You would get that reward, and that would give you your incentive to behave properly. The problem comes in precisely because we can't observe each other's past behavior. Now, maybe someday technology will deal with that for us. Okay, I envision an embedded monitor on your thigh that says this site has been accessed 357 times. But short of that, the problem is that we don't know who's who. So if we wanted, in principle, to have a system of taxes and subsidies, we wouldn't know who to tax and who to subsidize. The way you usually deal with that in economics is you try to think of a subsidy that only the people you want to subsidize will value, something that only the relatively cautious people will value, like maybe a library card, because the promiscuous people presumably have less use for that. So we give you a library card if you can prove you had a new partner last night. Or less frivolously, subsidize or free condoms. Because condoms, contrary to what you might at first expect, are most valuable to the least active people. And the reason for that is that the more active you are, the more likely you are to already be infected, and hence the less value the condom has. The more certain you are that you're not infected, the more you want that condom. So free condoms are most valuable to the least promiscuous, and that suggests that's one way of getting a subsidy to those people. So you know, the problem with this, of course, is that condoms are not that expensive in the first place, so this is not probably a substantial policy intervention. But we want to understand the idea. You know, there are a lot of people who say that free condoms have an upside and a downside as far as preventing the spread of diseases. The upside is that they directly prevent the spread of disease, and the downside is that they encourage more activity. Well, what I'm saying is that that's not an upside and a downside. That's two upsides. One, you directly prevent the spread of disease, and two, you encourage more activity by precisely the sort of people who you want to have more activity. Now, when you've got a principle powerful enough to lead to a surprise that big, because I think most people do find this conclusion very surprising, you should start looking for other places to apply that same principle. See what else you can get out of that same kind of thinking. So let me turn from the subject of sex to the perhaps closely related subject of reproduction. Let me ask the question, does the world have too many or too few people? Does the world have too many or too few people? That's a question that comes up a lot in public discussions. The first thing somebody always says when this question comes up, first thing somebody always asks is, well, how many people can the Earth support? How many people can the Earth support? This is not a person who's taking the question seriously. Because when you ask how many people can the Earth support, what you are effectively pointing out is that there is such a thing as too many people. There's a limit. There's such a thing as too many people. Well, we all knew that, okay? We all know there's such a thing as too many people. That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is the number of people we've got too many or too few? And that question doesn't address the how many people can the earth support. That doesn't address that question at all. If you want to know whether the world's got too many or too few of something, what you got to do is look at the incentives that the decision makers were facing, the costs and the benefits that they were weighing, and in particular, the costs and benefits that they failed to account for. The reason we know the world has too much pollution is not because pollution is bad, it's because the polluters are not accounting for the consequences of their actions. If we want to know whether the world has too much population, we've got to ask whether the decision makers are accounting for the consequences of their actions. Who are the decision makers? Well, when it comes to population, the decision makers are the parents and the potential parents who are deciding whether to have kids, whether to have another kid, when to stop. And what we want to do is we want to look at the costs and the benefits that those parents are facing. So I'm going to make a little chart here of benefits and costs. And what's critical here is that we don't want to just list benefits and costs. Instead, we want two categories. We want the benefits that we know they accounted for and the benefits and costs that we believe they didn't account for, because it's only the ones they didn't account for that mattered. If they were accounted, if all the costs and benefits of population growth were concentrated in the family that decided to have another kid, there'd be no problem here. They'd weigh those costs and benefits, they'd have the right number of kids. We're only interested in the ones that spill over. So we've got what we'll call the private costs, the ones that people account for, and what I called here the spillover costs, although if you're an economics student, you'll want to call them the external costs, externalities. It means the same thing. Okay. So what are some of the benefits of having a child? I want to start filling in these boxes with costs and benefits. What are some of the private benefits of having a child? Well, the big one is, for most of us, that we love our kids. And we expect our kids to love us, and we like that. Okay? And that's a large part of why we have kids. Okay? And you can interpret that very broadly, the emotional feeling of love, the interaction, the time spent at the football games, all the various ways in which we interact with our kids and get tremendous satisfaction from that. On the cost side, now what's going to go in the cost box there? Well, weighing on the other side, you got to feed your kids, and that's costly. You got to clothe them. You are going to have a lot of late nights staying up with them when they're sick. When they get a little older, you're bailing them out of jail all the time. Those are some of the costs that fall on the family that decided to have the kid. Those are not costs the rest of us need to worry about. If you have a kid and it keeps you up late at night, okay, well, that's a cost you chose to pay. That's not a reason for me to be concerned. What really matters is the spillovers, the stuff that does affect other people. So let me start on the benefit side. Obviously, we're going to have to come to the costs, but let's start on the benefit side. First of all, there's the fact that odds are very good, and it doesn't always seem this way at your age, but odds are very good that someday somebody other than your parents is going to love you. And that love is a benefit that you bring to the rest of the world, that your parents presumably did not fully account for. That's happiness you're going to bring to someone else. Love, friendship, the friendship you bring to other people, the diversity that you bring to the world, and that in multiple ways. Diversity just by being the unique individual that you are and having your unique points of view, your unique interests that the world would not otherwise have experienced. But secondly, possibly more important, the fact that by being here, you help to create a critical mass of people that will support diverse interests. Chamber music, parasailing, Ethiopian restaurants, the Warwick Economic Summit. Why do we have these things? Because there's a critical mass of people who are interested in them. And I'll tell you, it is a very small percentage of the population, okay, that wants to be sitting in this room listening to me right now. Okay? In order to have enough people to support this, we need a very, very big population to start with. so that that small percentage will be enough. So you contribute diversity. Then you contribute, and this is the big one, ideas. As you go through life, you have ideas, and every idea you have not only has the potential to benefit other people directly, but also is an idea that other people can copy, and people can copy them and improve on it, and that idea lives on long past you. Sometimes your ideas are little localized things like, hey, let's put on a show. Sometimes they're big world-changing things like, hey, I wonder if we could make computer chips out of silicon. And you know, when I give that example, I mean, it's so easy to think of all the fantastic technology we've got that all depends on ideas other people had. These cameras I'm looking at, the iPhone in your pocket, the iPad home on your desk, all those things came from ideas, but it's not just electronics. It's the farmer who thinks up a new method of crop rotation that his neighbors can copy. It's the business person who thinks up a new system of inventory control that other people can copy. These people make vast differences in the quality of life for the rest of us. One little idea makes a huge difference. Moreover, these ideas feed off each other. So first of all, why are ideas a side effect of population? First of all, the obvious. If you got more people, you got ideas. You got more ideas. A society with more people will have more ideas for the same reason that a high school with more students will have more successful football players. Second of all, ideas feed on each other. Each idea makes the next idea easier to come by. I had a historian recently tell me that the reason the Industrial Revolution happened when it did was that somehow the cultural notion spread that no matter what you did all day, it was worth taking a couple hours once a week to think about how to do it better, that ideas mattered. And those ideas triggered other ideas, which triggered other ideas, which triggered other ideas. Not only that, but ideas make other ideas more valuable. They interact with each other. The reason you can fly from London to Tokyo is partly because somebody figured out how to build an airplane, but also partly because somebody else figured out how to insure it. The reason you got that personal computer on your desk is partly because somebody said, hey, I wonder if we can make computer chips out of silicon, partly because somebody else said, hey, I wonder if we can fund startup companies with junk bonds. And those ideas interact to make the technology possible. Incidentally, if you want to know which of those inputs to the personal computer was more important, the silicon or the junk bonds, a very, very rough way to estimate that is to follow the money. If you go back to the early 1980s when the personal computer revolution was in its infancy, the annual profits, the annual economic profits at Microsoft were about $600 million a year. Michael Milken, the junk bond king, had an annual income of about $600 million a year, so it looks like roughly a tie. So ideas are so important that in my next slide, I made it bigger. Those are the big ways in which when I have a child, or when you have a child, that child goes out and makes the world a better place in ways you weren't thinking about. And those are arguments for encouraging people to have more children. But of course, we're not done. We have to also think about the spillover costs. What are the spillover costs of having a child? Resource consumption is the one that people typically think of. As you go through life, as a kid goes through life, that kid eats fish, burns fuel, takes up space, and that seems to come from other people. But before we can put resource consumption on our chart, we got to think about whether it goes on the left side of the chart or the right side of the chart. Is it a private cost that the parents accounted for, or an external cost that the parents didn't? Does it go here, or does it go there? I want to argue that a lot of it goes on the left. Think about where you get the resources you consume. Think about where you get those fish that you eat and that land that you occupy and that fuel that you burn. Where do you get it? Well, some of it you produce. Okay? You grow an apple that nobody else was going to grow anyway. That's not costing anybody anything. That's not a cost. Some of it you trade for. You grow an apple and you trade it for a fish. That's not a cost either, as long as it was a voluntary exchange and everybody's happy. Okay? That's not a cost. Another big source of resource consumption for most people, a big source of resources for most people, at least for most of the sort of people who are in this room today, is they get it from their parents. While their parents are alive, they get a tremendous amount of parental attention. They get help with things. They get help studying for school. They get financial assistance. And then when the parents die, they get an inheritance. Okay? That's huge for a lot of people. But which box does that go in? I want to claim those are costs that are mostly felt by the family. That's stuff that your parents knew was going to be a cost to the family when they decided they wanted to have you. Who do those costs fall on? Well, largely they fall on your siblings, right? If you have an older brother, then the day you were born was one of the worst days of that older brother's life, because you took half the parental attention, half the financial resources. Okay? Your chance of getting a car to drive when you were 16 years old just went way down. His chance. Took half the inheritance. So a lot of, and here's the point. Here's why this is relevant. Your parents cared about that older brother. They knew that when you were born, it was going to do that older brother a lot of damage. They loved him, but they still decided that you were worth it. They made that cost-benefit calculation. They decided that those costs that were going to fall on your siblings, who they cared about, were costs worth paying for the privilege of having you. You know, a lot of people get this wrong. A lot of people imagine that if I had never been born, there'd be a little more stuff for everybody else. Everybody else would have a tiny bit more. It's not true. Okay? If I hadn't been born, you guys would all be right where you are, and these two people here, my sisters, they'd each have a whole lot more. Okay? If I'd never been, that's who's bearing the cost of my resource consumption. And my parents care about them, and that suggests that that resource consumption goes in the left-hand box. Now, of course, those are not the only sources of resources. That's not the only places we get our resources. Sometimes we get resources by theft. Sometimes we get them by making war on people, conquering people. Sometimes we get them in ways that create major amounts of pollution. Those are all spillover effects. Those are all externalities. Those are all costs on people that that are outside our family. Those are things our parents did not account for. And we might also add to that sometimes we go on public assistance, and that's a cost that falls outside the family. So those are things that are going to go in the box there. How are we going to measure those costs? I'm not going to do that for you today. What I want to give you is a way of thinking. If you want to think about whether the world's got too many people or too few, what you got to do is, first of all, ignore everything on the left, because the family already accounted for that. And ask yourself, what's going on the right? Are those external benefits greater or less than those external costs? Now, my guess, if you did this carefully, which I have not, my guess, if you did this carefully, is that you would find that the external benefits far exceed the external costs. That the power of those ideas and the love and the diversity and so on far exceeds, for the average person, their thievery and conquering and pollution. Most of us are not thieves or warriors or major polluters. And so I am guessing that the upper box on the right is going to dwarf the lower box on the right. And if that's true, that means that families are having too few kids. It means the world population is too small. Let me illustrate this another way, the idea of keeping things inside the family versus what spills over. Suppose we got two families. They each live on a plot of land. Those are our two identical plots of land on which these families live. And one family doubles its size from one generation to the next. So everybody in that family is now living on half a plot of land. The other family, the one on the right, they practice zero population growth. So their per capita land doesn't change. The next generation, this family grows again, grows again, grows again. Several generations down the line, the family on the right, they're prospering, everybody's very wealthy. They got this vast amount of land per person. The family on the left, they're poor. They got a whole lot of grandchildren and they love having grandchildren. Okay? This is not, so far, a social problem. This is an opportunity to celebrate diversity. Some people would rather be rich, some people would rather have big families. As long as their choices don't spill over on each other, there's no reason for anyone to second guess them. Now, it is absolutely true that if this family over here gets tired of being poor and decides to form an army and go over and take land from the family on the right, then the family on the right's got a legitimate reason to be concerned about that. If the family on the left builds big factories that belch smoke over onto the land on the right, the family on the right's got a reason to be concerned about that. But on the other hand, let's not lose sight of all the other things the family on the right is getting from the family on the left. All those vast number of ideas to copy, that vast pool of potential lovers, potential mates, potential friends, that vast pool of people exploring different ways of thinking, different ways of doing things, writing books that people are going to read, again, coming up with technological ideas, social ideas that can be copied. That's the other stuff we want to count. I have one child. She's a daughter. She just got engaged. I am so thankful. She got engaged to a wonderful guy. I am so thankful that his parents were not practicing zero population growth. And somewhere in this world, maybe in this room, there's a young woman about my daughter's age whose life has been permanently impoverished by the fact that I did not have the son who would have someday swept her off her feet. Now, why didn't I have that son? Because I only wanted one kid. I was selfish. I did the selfish thing. I wanted one kid, I had one kid. Selfish calculation, it was the right calculation for me. But the point is that if I had cared about that young woman as much as I care about my own daughter, I would have had that son. That suggests that people are making the wrong social calculation, that they're having too few kids. And I threw that one in to prove we're related. Before we leave the topic of population, I want to say a couple words about overcrowding. Overcrowding. If you think of overcrowding as a cost, if you walk around London and people are jostling you and you hate the crowd, I have no sympathy for that whatsoever. Because overcrowding, if ever there were a voluntary cost, it's that. The world is mostly empty. If you're in a crowded place, it's because you want to be there. If you're in a crowded place, now people say, oh, well, I want to be in London because that's where they have the symphonies, and that's where they have the theater, and that's where they have the good jobs. But of course, the reason they have the symphonies and the theater and the good jobs is because that's the stuff that goes with crowds. If you want that package, it's there for you. If you don't want that package, you can live someplace else. People don't realize how empty the world is, and the reason for that is that it's the crowded places that get all the attention. Okay? It's the crowded places that get all the attention. That's where interesting stuff is happening. If you read the newspapers, if you read the American newspapers, you will think that my country looks like this. Okay? But if you actually fly over it, you discover it looks like this. I mean, it seems like there are a lot of people in the world. They all fit in the Grand Canyon if you stack them right. Or, if you don't like that image, here's an image that I stole from Thomas Sowell. Take the state of Texas, divide it into home lots of 5,000 square feet each, which is a reasonable sized lot to put a nice little home on. Put a family of 4 in each of those homes, and you have just housed the entire world's population. There is a lot of space in the world, and again, it's easy to focus on the crowds because that's somehow what we notice. When you're stuck in traffic on a hot summer night, it's really easy to remember that your life is being made worse by the guy in front of you. Somehow you forget that your life is being made better by the guy who invented car air conditioning. And that if we had fewer people, we could well have gotten rid of both of them. So if I come back to my chart with the private and the spillover benefits, I want to close this by saying that if you, I'm using population as an example, I use sex as an example, but the broader point, well, there's a broader point and then an even broader point. The broader point is that any time you face a question of whether the world's got too much or too little of something, you cannot productively address that question unless you ask what incentives were the decision makers facing, which of those incentives spilled over on other people, which of those costs and benefits spilled over on other people, what were those spillovers, zero in on the spillovers. Are the spillover benefits greater or less than the spillover costs? That's the question you got to answer. The broader point is that logic is both fun and useful, and economic logic in particular is both fun and useful. Sometimes it surprises you. Sometimes we discover things that are not at all what we expected. Well, that's fine. Surprises are fun. Surprises are educational. And if our inquiries never revealed anything unexpected, then of course there'd be no point in pursuing them. The reason we think about stuff is so that we can learn something new. So my big message is follow logic wherever it leads you, follow it fearlessly wherever it leads you. Don't worry too much if it seems to lead you in a different direction than common sense. One of the other speakers said this morning, common sense is what tells you that the earth is flat. And I'll second that, and I'll close there, and if there are questions, I'll take them.